I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak today on new antiretroviral drugs in formulation for treatment and prevention of HIV. These are my conflicts of interests, and I would like to acknowledge all people with HIV who've contributed to the wealth of clinical research studies and trials which underpin our evidence base for treatment and prevention today. Today, I'm going to cover the treatment of HIV infection, the role of two-drug regimens, less frequent dosing of antiretroviral therapy with long-acting injectables, and cover a little bit of regimens on the horizon, both oral agents and injectables. And I'm going to finish with the prevention of HIV infection with long-acting injectables. Now, these are the current antiretroviral guidelines for initiation of antiretroviral therapy, covering both the World Health Organization guidelines plus those from higher income countries. You will see that integrase inhibitors form the backbone of most of the recommended initial regimens. And in fact, for the high income countries, the two-drug regimen of dolutegravir 3TC is recommended as an initial regimen, but not by WHO. The data supporting the use of a two-drug regimen of dolutegravir and lamivudine as ART initiation comes from the Gemini studies. Dolutegravir and 3TC was compared with dolutegravir and tenofovir disoproxil fumarate and tricidabine in 1,400 antiretroviral naive individuals. And as can be seen from this graph of rates of virological suppression at less than 50 copies per mil, at week 144, there was no difference between the two arms. So non-inferiority in as far as efficacy goes was maintained to almost 3 years. So durability concerns raised by many have not been borne out. Now, why is this two-drug regimen perhaps not recommended as initial ART by WHO? And that's because those with chronic hepatitis B or those not immune to hepatitis B but at risk of it need 2 nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors active against hepatitis B in their ART regimen. There is also insufficient data in pregnancy for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission with 2 drugs. If there is any baseline resistance to either drug in the regimen, the 3TC or the integrase inhibitor, dolutegravir, the 2-drug regimen is contraindicated. And in many low and middle income settings, there is minimal availability of baseline genotypes. The studies did not include participants with very high viral loads. So baseline HIV RNAs of greater than 500,000 copies per mil are not recommended. And of course, same day ART initiation as HIV diagnosis, which is recommended by WHO, means that you need to know your hepatitis B. You need to know your baseline resistance, which is not available. So let's look at less frequent dosing with the long-acting formulations of Cabotegravir and Rilpivirine. These were first approved in Canada over 2 years ago, followed by the European approval, USA approval. In Australia, where I come from, the approval by the TGA was in May of 2021, but pharmaceutical reimbursement only occurred a few months ago, and it is only available for 2-monthly administration in Australia. Well, recently the FDA has removed the 4-week oral lead-in. This is now optional, so that you don't have to use oral Cabotegravir and Rilpivirine prior to the injections. Now, the data supporting long-acting Cabotegravir and Rilpivirine comes from 3 randomized controlled studies. They're all non-inferiority studies done to look at maintenance of virological suppression. The FLAIR study recruited antiretroviral naive individuals, but they were put on abacavir 3TC, dolutegravir, for 6 months. And those that were virologically suppressed were then randomized to continue that regimen or have 4-weekly Cabotegravir Rilpivirine. The ATLAS study was similar in that it just took virologically suppressed individuals for at least 4 months on a combination regimen and randomized them to switch to long-acting Cabotegravir or maintain their oral regimen. The ATLAS 2M study took those people that were on monthly Cabotegravir Rilpivirine injections and randomized them to continue 4 weekly injections or to transition to 8 weekly injections. You can see the rates of maintenance of virological suppression after 1 to 3 years of treatment were very high, and there were no difference between the oral continuation arms or the injection arms. However, in the ATLAS 2M study, there were confirmed virological failures, 11 in the Q8 week arm and 2 in the Q4 week arm. These are the virological outcomes at 3 years. This is the intention to treat analysis. In the darker green is the 4-week arm, lighter green, 8-week arm. These are the per protocol results, but you can see very high rates. And this is the primary efficacy outcome, the proportion with viral loads less than 50 copies per mil, non-inferior between the 2 arms. But there is a small but real increased risk of virological failure in the Q8 week arm, 2% versus less than 1%. And this was despite perfect adherence. There was absolutely no delayed injections in the ATLAS 2M study. Of concern is of the 11 people with virological failure in the Q8 arm, 9 developed Rilpivirine resistance mutations and 8 developed INSTI resistance mutations. The 2 people in the Q4 week arm, 1 developed Rilpivirine resistance and both developed INSTI resistance. Now, this will have an impact on subsequent treatment regimens for these individuals. Some people have suggested we need to do more frequent viral load testing to align with the 8 weekly injections to make sure we're aware of people who are starting to fail treatment. What about adverse reactions? Injection site reactions are very common. 80% experience them, but only 1% led to study discontinuation. The majority of mild to moderate and resolve in 7 days. There was no difference between arms in weight gain, and withdrawal from the study was actually more common in the Q4 week arm because of the frequency of visits and injection site reactions. Now, some investigators have looked at predictors of virological failure across the 3 phase 3 studies and found that a BMI greater than 30 kilograms per metre squared, baseline proviral Rilpivirine resistance, and an HIV subtype A1 or A6, as well as low Rilpivirine levels at week 8, were all predictors of virological failure. But you need a combination of 2 or more baseline risk factors. So that is a high BMI, proviral Rilpivirine resistance, or an A1 or A6 subtype to be at higher risk for resistance. So there are people that are not suitable for long-acting Cabotegravir and Rilpivirine, just like there are for 2 drug regimens with dolutegravir 3TC. And similarly, it's those with chronic hepatitis B co-infection. There's no active drug against hepatitis B in that regimen. There's insufficient safety data for the long-acting injectables in pregnancy. And of course, resistance to either drug in the regimen or prior treatment failure with a regimen including an integrase inhibitor or a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor is a contraindication to this treatment. A relative contraindication is those that have difficulty with adherence for oral therapy or to clinic visits for administration of the 2 monthly injections. Now, as clinics try to implement long-acting injectables, challenges have occurred. In high-income countries, infrastructure, clinic space, available staff have been the major issues. Self-administration of this treatment is not possible, and a clinic visit for administration, the median time is 30 minutes. In the US, there's onerous paperwork for the insurance companies, and otherwise there's increased costs and co-pays for patients, including missed work and transportation costs to and from the clinic. So flexible models are needed. What about the feasibility in the resource-limited setting? Overburdened clinics and patient workflow, people cycling in and out of care, all raise issues. The clinics are going to need alternative providers or administrators because this is a deep intramuscular injection into both buttocks, into the gluteal muscle. And there is a cold chain requirement for the long-acting rilpivirine component. And of course, cost. ViiV, the manufacturer of this long-acting treatment, is seeking a generic partner for the voluntary license required for long-acting injectables. Manufacturing complexity, regulatory requirements, capital investment, and unpredictable demand have all been challenges for the generic partners. We do know that long-acting Cabotegravir and Rilpivirine is registered in Hong Kong and Taiwan in the Asian region, but reimbursement process has not been sorted out yet. Stock is expected in the next few months for a user-paying model. Registration is also underway in some other Asian countries. What about novel agents for salvage therapy? There is Fostemsavir, which is approved in combination with other ART for people with multi-drug resistance and virological failure. It's a prodrug that's an entry inhibitor. It binds to GP120, making a conformational change to the virus so that entry by the CD4 cell receptor is blocked. People requiring salvage therapy often have adherence issues. This drug requires dosing twice daily, which will be an issue. It is used with an optimized antiretroviral background based on genotypic mutations and tolerability. Ipilimumab is a monoclonal antibody which also blocks HIV entry by binding to the CD4 cell receptor this time. It is administered by intravenous infusion every 2 weeks. It's been approved for salvage therapy in the US for people with multi-drug resistant virus and virological failure. However, it's not available outside the US of A. Albuvatide has been developed and trialled and is licensed in China. It also is a fusion inhibitor, binds to the GP41, again preventing conformational change, preventing virus entry. It also is an intravenous infusion that requires to be administered once weekly. It is currently in clinical trials in the US in combination with broadly neutralizing antibodies. Let's move to Islatravir. This is a nucleoside translocation inhibitor. It blocks translocation as well as it has a delayed chain termination effect. It's active against HIV with multiple NRTI mutations. It has a much higher barrier to resistance and a very long half-life. However, its development has met a roadblock. Reductions in lymphocyte counts and subsequently CD4 cell counts have been seen in treatment studies. There's been no associated increase in infections, including opportunistic infections, but the FDA placed a full, partial, or complete hold on all trials of islatravir. And as you can see here, the PrEP trials are on full hold, with the implant trial just not starting. Those that were switching have been put on their original antiretroviral regimen. What about lenacapavir? Lenacapavir is a long-acting capsid protein inhibitor. It actually acts in multiple stages of the HIV replication cycle, with the majority of action at the nuclear transport area. Its pharmacokinetic characteristics make it suitable for oral daily or weekly administration, as well as for 6-monthly subcutaneous injection. At the recent CROI conference, there were 2 studies reported using lenacapavir. One was in antiretroviral naive individuals, and the 54-week results were reported. There were 4 treatment arms for this antiretroviral naive study. The standard of care arm of Capbotegravir and FTAF, then a comparison with oral lenacapavir and FTAF, and then there were 2 arms that utilised subcutaneous lenacapavir 6 monthly with oral FTAF. And these are the results here. From 85 to 92% virological suppression at 1 year. There were only 2 people with virological failure who developed resistance to lenacapavir. And then there was a salvage therapy study. Much smaller numbers of patients. There were 36 who were randomized into a functional 14-day monotherapy study, 24 with oral lenacapavir, 10 with placebo, who then went on to subcutaneous lenacapavir and an optimized background regimen, and another 36 that just went straight to lenacapavir and an optimized background regimen. Astonishing results here in this salvage therapy regimen, with 83% virological suppression to less than 50 copies per mil at 1 year, with 8 cases of emergent resistance. Injection site reactions were also a feature of long-acting lenacapavir injections. In the antiretroviral naive study, they occurred in up to 15%, with some people developing nodules that could last up to 6 months. 25% in the highly treatment experienced study experienced injection site reactions. Otherwise, it was very well tolerated. Unfortunately, lenacapavir has also met a roadblock, with the FDA hold being put on in March of 2022. Their new drug application was rejected over concerns of the borosilicate glass vials used for storage of the drug. Lenacapavir compatibility with these glass vials led to the production of subvisual glass particles, and Gilead is currently working with the FDA to try to find a solution to this. So the lenacapavir-islatravir union that was announced after CROI 2021 is on hold, and lenacapavir is looking for a new partner as a long-acting injectable agent. Let's move finally to long-acting Cabotegravir for HIV prevention. This has been licensed in the US in December 2021. Nowhere else in the world has it been licensed. It requires 2 intramuscular gluteal injections 1 month apart, followed by 2 monthly 3 ml injection of 600 milligrams of Cabotegravir. There were other options in clinical trials: subcutaneous lenacapavir, oral islatravir, and yearly islatravir implant. Unfortunately, they are all on hold. There were 2 studies to support the licensing of long-acting Cabotegravir for prevention: HPTN 083, which was performed in men who have sex with men and transgender women, and HPTN 084 in cisgender women in sub-Saharan Africa. There was a large number of people recruited to the trials. They were young, at 25 to 26 years, followed for 1 to 3 years. And you can see the rates of incident HIV infection in the two studies. So the efficacy in HPT in 083 was a 66% lower risk of HIV infection, and in HPT in 084, an astonishing 88% lower risk of infection. Now, these incident HIV infections occurred at different times. There were some undetected infections at enrolment in the 083 study. There was only one in the 084 study. So undetected at enrolment is a problem. There were also 5 people who developed HIV who either had a missed Cabotegravir injection or never started their Cabotegravir infections. But there were 4 people in HPT in 083 who had expected plasma Cabotegravir concentrations who developed HIV infection. Now, the problem with this was that there was a delay in detection of HIV by routine HIV assays. It was up to 98 days in the 083 study. So the current CDC recommendation for HIV monitoring in people on long-acting Cabotegravir includes 2 monthly HIV antigen antibody tests plus a qualitative HIV RNA test. This is not going to be feasible in low and middle income countries and possibly many high income countries. Cost is another barrier. There's no generic partner for the voluntary license for production of long-acting Cabotegravir for the low and middle income country setting. We need flexible models of care for administration. There is a long PK tail, which happens to be longer in women than in men, with 67 weeks before Cabotegravir concentrations become undetectable after the last injection, which raises the issue about incident infections and development of resistance. Thankfully, there is no cold chain requirement. So in summary, we have many more potent 2-drug regimens, both currently and on the horizon. There are long-acting injectables licensed in many high-income countries, but lagging in implementation there. We need to ensure equitable global access to the new classes and formulations, with registration of long-acting injectables lagging in the majority of low and middle income settings. So I'll finish there. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in the Department of Infectious Diseases at the Alfred Hospital, and also my patients, my constant inspiration to find better treatments for better health and quality of life. Thank you.